Daniel had been driving for hours when he saw the first sign. It stood alone at the roadside, rusted and leaning slightly, its reflective letters catching the glow of his headlights. Do not stop after dark. He barely had time to process the message before his car sped past it, swallowing the sign in darkness. Daniel frowned. That was odd. He had driven this highway dozens of times before, but he had never seen a sign like that. Was it new? A joke? A glance at his GPS showed nothing unusual, just Highway 19, stretching endlessly through the night. Shrugging, he kept driving, numbing, but a few miles later, another sign. Do not look in the ditches. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. This one was even more rusted than the last, its letters barely legible. And worse, it had bullet holes in it. A strange unease settled in his stomach. Maybe he had taken a wrong turn. Maybe this wasn't Highway 19 at all. The radio crackled with static. Daniel exhaled, forcing himself to relax. He was letting his mind play tricks on him. Just keep driving. Then up ahead, a figure in the road. Daniel slammed the brakes. His car skidded to a stop, gravel crunching beneath the tires. His heart pounded as he stared at the figure crawling out of the ditch. It was a man, barefoot, dirty. His clothes were torn, his arms covered in scratches. His eyes wide, too wide. They reflected the headlights like an animal's, glowing eerily in the dark. The man lifted a trembling hand. His lips moved. He was whispering. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears. He couldn't hear what the man was saying, couldn't even tell if he was making words at all. Then the man smiled. The smile stretched across the man's face too far. Daniel's breath hitched. The man wasn't just grinning. His lips kept pulling back, the corners of his mouth curling past the limits of human anatomy. His gums glistened under the headlights, his teeth too white, too perfect, too many. Daniel's entire body screamed at him to go, but he didn't move. The man in the ditch was mouthing something, whispering, but the words weren't reaching Daniel's ears. It was like sound itself refused to carry his voice. Then, in a single jerking movement, the man's head snapped toward the woods. And suddenly, Daniel knew that there was something else out there. His heart pounded as his eyes flicked to the trees. The darkness between them was absolute, the kind of black that swallowed light whole. But something was moving. Tall, skeletal figures shifted just beyond the reach of his high beams. Too many limbs, too long. And the worst part? Their eyes reflected the light. Not like animals, not like people, like mirrors. Daniel's stomach twisted. Every instinct he had screamed at him to look away. But he couldn't, because the man in the ditch had stopped whispering. And now he was staring right at Daniel. The grin still stretched impossibly wide. His lips parted. And this time, Daniel heard him. They don't like to be seen. Daniel didn't think, didn't breathe, didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the gas. The tires shrieked against the asphalt as his car lurched forward. Gravel spat from the wheels as he shot past the grinning man, past the ditch, past the whispering trees. He didn't look back, but he didn't have to, because suddenly the whispering was inside the car. Daniel's vision blurred as he gripped the wheel, white-knuckled. The voices slithered around him, seeping into his skull like tendrils of smoke. Too late. You stopped. You looked. The rearview mirror vibrated violently. Daniel forced himself to glance at it, just for a second, and nearly swerved off the road. The highway behind him was full of eyes. Hundreds of them, floating in the dark, reflecting his taillights. Some were human-sized, others were massive, glistening orbs that pulsed like they were alive. And in the middle of them all, the man was still there, standing in the road, grinning and waving. Daniel ripped his eyes from the mirror. The road ahead was curving. A sign loomed on the shoulder, its letters worn and scratched. He barely had time to read it as he tore past. No turning back. His hands trembled. His breath came in short gasps. He was speeding at nearly 90 miles an hour, but the whispering wouldn't stop, wouldn't leave him alone. Something shifted in the back seat. No, he hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the weight shift in the car, but something was there, and it was breathing. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. The whispering crawled against his skin, sliding between his ribs, filling his lungs. "Pull over. Just for a second. Let us in," Daniel screamed. His fingers clenched the wheel. His foot pressed harder on the gas. He wasn't stopping. Not again, not ever. And then the lights of a gas station appeared ahead. A miracle, a beacon, a way out. Daniel's car skidded violently as he swerved into the station's lot. The old flickering lights cast the asphalt in a sickly glow. The place was deserted. He threw the car into park and flung himself out, staggering onto solid ground. Silence. The whispering was gone. His chest heaved as he turned back toward the road. The highway was empty. No eyes, no figures, no grinning man standing in the ditch. Just miles of quiet, endless blacktop. Daniel's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He turned toward the gas station. The windows were covered in grime, the fluorescent lights inside buzzing faintly. He pushed through the door, the bell overhead jangling in the stillness. An old man sat behind the counter, weathered, wrinkled, his eyes dull with exhaustion. He barely looked up. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Sir," he gasped, voice barely more than a whisper. There was something on the road." The old man's expression didn't change. He just sighed, shook his head, and said, "You took the wrong road, didn't you?" Daniel froze. His blood turned to ice. Because the old man wasn't surprised. Not confused, not concerned. Just tired, like he'd seen it before. Daniel's voice cracked. "What the hell was that place?" The old man exhaled through his nose. Then slowly, he reached under the counter and pulled something out. An old road sign. Rusted, bent. Its letters barely visible under the layers of dirt. But Daniel still recognized it. He had seen it earlier. The old man tapped a finger against the words, his face lined with something like regret. Daniel didn't need to read it. He already knew what it said. "Do not stop after dark." The highway was supposed to be empty at this hour. That was the whole reason Dale took night shifts. No traffic, no distractions, just long, open roads stretching endlessly into the dark. It was peaceful, or at least it was supposed to be. Tonight, though, the highway was anything but empty. He had been making good time until he saw the flashing red and blue lights up ahead. A sea of stopped vehicles, hazard lights blinking in the dark, stretched across both lanes. Dale groaned, rolling down his window to listen to the distant wail of sirens. The wreck must have been fresh. "God damn it," he muttered, checking his GPS. The screen flickered, trying to reroute him. "Accident ahead. Expect delays." Dale drummed his fingers against the wheel. He couldn't afford to be late. This was his last haul before his vacation, and he had a long way to go. Then the GPS suggested something else. Rerouting. Take County Road 47 through Black Hollow. Dale frowned. He didn't recognize the name. He zoomed in on the map. The road was a thin gray line that wound through dense forest before reconnecting to the highway about 20 miles ahead. A shortcut. He looked back at the sea of taillights. Screw it. With a sharp turn of the wheel, he veered onto the exit ramp, following the GPS into the unknown. The new road was narrower than he expected, barely 2 lanes wide, with thick trees pressing in on both sides. His headlights cast long shadows through the skeletal branches, making the whole stretch of asphalt look like it was caged in by the forest. No streetlights, no signs. The GPS claimed this was a major road, but it felt more like an old logging trail. Dale kept one hand on the wheel, the other drumming absently against his leg. The longer he drove, the thicker the trees became. The forest here felt ancient, untouched, the kind of place where time moved slower, where things lurked in the underbrush unseen. Then his headlights caught something. It was a pair of eyes reflecting back at him from the roadside. Dale barely had time to register them before they were gone, swallowed by the trees. Probably a deer. It wasn't uncommon for animals to stare blankly into headlights before darting off. Still, something about those eyes unsettled him. They didn't blink. Dale tried to shake it off, focusing on the road ahead. But a few miles later, his headlights caught another pair of eyes. Then another, each time just barely visible between the trees, watching from the darkness. He started paying attention to the height. They weren't low to the ground, like a deer or a raccoon. These were higher. Too high. His grip on the wheel tightened. Just animals, he muttered under his breath, though the words felt hollow. Then he noticed something worse. The eyes weren't just watching from the sides of the road anymore. They were behind him. Dale glanced in his rearview mirror and nearly slammed on the brakes. His taillights reflected a wall of eyes in the distance. Dozens, maybe hundreds, staring unblinking from the road behind him. His heart jackhammered in his chest. He had passed no houses, no side roads, no other cars. So what the hell was standing there? Dale floored the gas. The truck's engine roared as he pushed the speedometer past 70. He didn't care about the narrow road anymore. He just needed to get the hell out of here. The GPS said he had 10 more miles before the shortcut rejoined the highway. 10 miles felt like forever. The further he went, the worse it got. The trees pressed closer, and the darkness between them shifted. It took him too long to realize why. The eyes were moving, keeping pace. Dale's breath came in short gasps. He turned up the radio, trying to drown out his own heartbeat. A staticky country song crackled through the speakers. Then, thump, something hit the roof of his truck. Dale swerved, barely keeping the rig on the road. His heart slammed against his ribs as he checked his mirrors. Nothing. But then, through the open window, he heard it. A whispering, low and crawling, like wind through dead leaves. Except there was no wind, and it was coming from above him. Dale didn't think. He just drove. The GPS claimed the highway was just ahead. A single green road sign loomed in the distance, its surface riddled with bullet holes. But Dale didn't slow down. His headlights caught one last glimpse of the road behind him. The eyes weren't just on the roadside anymore. They were on the pavement, standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at him. For the first time, he saw their shapes. Not animals, not human, just long, skeletal figures with reflective eyes and two wide grins, waiting. Dale refused to stop. The truck roared forward, barreling straight for them. At the last second, the figures moved, not by stepping aside, but by blurring, smearing like a corrupted image on a screen, shifting between 1 second and the next. Then, just like that, the highway was in front of him. Dale shot past the sign, tires skidding as he merged back onto the main road. The second his wheels hit fresh pavement, the whispers stopped. The road behind him was empty. No eyes, no figures. Just a quiet, abandoned road disappearing into the trees. His hands trembled on the wheel. The radio crackled again. And for just a moment, before the static swallowed it, he swore he heard laughter. Amy had been driving for hours, the highway stretching endlessly under her headlights. The road was empty, silent. Just the hum of the engine and the occasional flash of reflector posts passing in the dark. She was used to these late-night drives. Ever since she moved out of the city, getting home always meant long stretches of lonely road. Tonight was no different, or at least it shouldn't have been. The first sign that something was wrong came when her radio cut out. Amy frowned, tapping the screen on her dashboard. Static. That was odd. She was still near a service area. The station should have been clear. Then her headlights caught something in the road. It was lying across the asphalt ahead, long and dark, like a fallen tree limb. But as her beams illuminated it, something moved. It was glimmering. Amy had only a second to react before the shape jerked, and suddenly it was staring at her. A wide, wet eye larger than a plate, swiveled toward her, reflecting the headlights like a mirror. Amy's breath caught in her throat. Then, thud, she hit it. The car jolted violently, metal screeching as the tires skidded over the thing in the road. The wheel jerked and she swerved toward the shoulder, slamming to a stop in a cloud of dust. For a moment, everything was silent. Then her shaking hands fumbled for the door handle. Amy stepped out, breath clouding in the cold air. The highway was too quiet. No wind, no night sounds. Just her own footsteps crunching on the gravel as she walked toward the back of the car. Her headlights still bathed the road ahead in white light. The thing she hit was gone. Her stomach turned. There should have been something. A dent, a smear of blood, tire marks, but the road was pristine. No damage, no debris, no body. Amy turned in a slow circle, scanning the empty road. The highway stretched into blackness on both sides. Then, in her periphery, something moved. Amy's head snapped toward the trees lining the road. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. Then, slowly, her shape unfolded. A figure was standing just beyond the reach of her headlights. Tall, wrong. Its skin was slick, gleaming under the moonlight. And its face, it was the eye. A single massive eye in the center of its head, unblinking, fixed on her. Amy's breath hitched. The thing took a step forward. Its skin rippled. Amy bolted. She barely registered slamming the car door before jamming the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life and she threw it into gear, tires screeching as she peeled away from the shoulder. Her hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. She didn't look back, didn't dare. But then, thud, something hit the roof. Amy screamed. The whole car shook as if something heavy had dropped onto it from above. She slammed the gas pedal to the floor. Another thump. This time it came from the windshield. Amy's stomach twisted as she saw her hands slapping against the glass. No, not a hand, a limb. Too long, too many joints. The skin glistened like raw meat, veins pulsing under its surface. The thing was on the car. Amy swerved violently, trying to shake it off. The tires screeched. The limbs slid across the windshield, leaving behind a slick, oily residue. Then for the first time she heard it, a wet, sucking sound, like something pulling itself free from tar. She didn't want to see where it was coming from, but she couldn't stop herself. Amy looked up and saw its eyes staring at her through the sunroof. Her foot was still pressed against the gas, the speedometer creeping past 80. The eye didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. Amy's breath came in gasps, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She was miles from the next town, miles from help. The road stretched into endless black. She had one option left. Gripping the wheel, she jerked it hard. The car fishtailed. The creature lurched. Amy hit the brakes. With a horrific screech of metal and rubber, the car spun out, slamming into the guardrail. The impact threw the thing off. She heard a sickening crunch as its body hit the pavement. For a moment, there was silence. Amy sucked in a trembling breath, her whole body shaking. Then slowly she turned her head. The thing was lying in the road, sprawled out like a broken puppet, its limbs bent at impossible angles. A thick black fluid seeped from its torn skin, shimmering under the headlights. For a second, she thought it was dead. Then it twitched. Amy's pulse spiked. The thing's limbs snapped back into place with wet, bone-cracking pops. Then in one slow, jerking motion, it got up. Amy's scream caught in her throat. The creature turned toward her, its massive, unblinking eye locking onto her. It took a step, then another. Amy slammed the gas pedal. The car lurched forward. She didn't stop, didn't look back. But as she sped away, she caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. The thing was standing in the road, watching, then slowly, it smiled.